Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. What are the boundaries of the president's power? And what happens when the executive crosses those boundaries? That's what legal scholars are trying to understand. That's because, among other things, the Trump administration deported Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He was born in El Salvador and lived in Maryland for 15 years. He had protections by a U.S. immigration judge, but the Trump administration deported him anyway, and they're defying court orders to bring him back. That's happening at the national level. Trump's defiance of court orders is also having a local impact. For one thing, more migrant children in Detroit immigration are likely to not have attorneys. That's because in March, the Trump administration eliminated a legal aid program serving about 26,000 migrant children. The legal aid program was stopped in defiance of a federal judge's orders. Already, the Michigan Immigration Rights Center has had to lay off half of its staff because of this defiance. Now, in the case of Abrego Garcia, the Trump administration said Sunday it's not required to engage El Salvador's government to bring him back. So what does this all mean for us here in Michigan? Our next guest argues that what happened to Abrego Garcia could happen to any of us. Barb McQuade is a University of Michigan law professor and former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. Barb, welcome back to the Metro.
Thanks very much, Robin. Great to be with you.
And we should note the Metro contacted 2 Republican leaders in the Michigan State House for comment. We have yet to hear back from them. We'll keep you posted on that. So, Barb, you wrote in an op-ed in the Detroit Free Press that Abrego Garcia's case creates a danger for every American. Say more.
Well, the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to due process before any of us can be denied life, liberty, or property. And that applies to anyone who is within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, including Mr. Abrego Garcia. The idea that the government could accidentally send him to a foreign prison and then say, sorry, we have no power to bring him back, is incredibly dangerous. Imagine if you or I were accidentally scooped up and sent to a foreign prison, and the government said, we can't bring you back. What should happen in a case like Mr. Abrego Garcia, as you said, he was living here for 15 years. His removal was withheld for fear that he would face persecution in El Salvador by gangs that had extorted his family's business. A mistake was made. They arrested him. And what protects us from those kinds of mistakes is due process, which means notice and an opportunity to be heard. So he should have received a hearing where he could contest his removability. And then if there was a mistake, a judge would find out, and he would not have been sent in the first place. So that's the first part of due process. But the idea, and the appeals court in this case said so, it's appalling to think that the government would say, well, we made a mistake and now he's gone, and then wash their hands of it. They return people who are wrongfully deported all the time, as a matter of course, the court says. And so the idea that now they're saying it's out of the country, therefore it's out of our hands, is really frightening. They essentially have kidnapped this man, put him in a foreign terrorist prison, and have said there's nothing we can do to get him back.
Barb, some people will say, well, Abrego Garcia is originally from El Salvador. He wasn't born here. Why are the odds of this happening again for someone, let's say, who is born in the U.S., of getting picked up by federal government agents and not being returned to the country or having some of their other rights violated? Why are those odds higher now?
Well, we've never seen a situation like this before where a president and his administration are really pushing the boundaries of executive power. One of the arguments that they've made is that the courts are without jurisdiction to even hear this case. The Supreme Court rejected that argument. But that's the standard on which they are operating, that they are going to maximize, it seems to me, executive power. And the boundaries of that are not clear. in the past, we have had a lot of presidents who have pushed that envelope. We saw it with the administration of George W. Bush in an effort to protect our country after 9/11, to push the limits and sometimes crossing those limits. But I never had the sense that they were acting in bad faith. They seemed to be trying to push the legal limits in an effort to protect our country. And so when there was a court order that they had exceeded the limit, they pulled back. What we're seeing instead from this administration is when courts order them to facilitate the return of Mr. Abrego Garcia, saying things like, you can't make me, or all we have to do to facilitate his return is we can't turn him away if he should somehow find his way back to our border. They know that's not going to happen. The phrase was facilitate his return. And it seems that at every step, according to the judge, they are engaging in gamesmanship to avoid complying with that order. I don't think we've ever seen that before. And so I think that is what makes this moment so dangerous.
So you would say the Trump administration's defiance of court orders reflects that it's acting in bad faith. I wonder, have there been any other times that the president can or should defy court orders? I mean, it sounds like you're describing what you feel is an unprecedented moment.
Yeah, no, the court should not be defying court orders. That is unprecedented, and that is a very dangerous time. You know, there are some murky boundaries of presidential power. There are recognition of what's called inherent power in the Constitution under Article 2. The fact that the Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces gives him a lot of authority to protect national security and to engage in foreign policy and foreign diplomacy. And so there's a lot of wiggle room there that has not been defined because presidents usually comply with those norms and they do obey court orders. And so, you know, pushing the limit of that and testing the waters, I think, is one thing. But once a court says that is a violation of the law, to then defy that order, I think is something we have not seen before.
I'm glad you brought up that the president is the commander-in-chief of armed forces, because that has me thinking about the courts, which do not have a standing army of their own. So if the president defies federal orders, what can the courts do as a response to ensure the law is followed?
Well, this is the big what-if question, right, that people sometimes refer to as a constitutional crisis, because they don't have federal agents who can enforce orders. The U.S. Marshal Service, which does provide protection and security at courthouses and moves prisoners around, is part of the Department of Justice. And so if the president ordered the marshals to do something or not to do something that the court had ordered them to do, their loyalty lies with their boss, which is at the Department of Justice, the Attorney General. But there are things that the courts can do short of, trying to use brute force. One, they can hold members of the executive branch in contempt. They can bring with them fines. They can order the jailing of people until they comply. We'll see whether jailing on site is something that the U.S. Marshals would be in agreement to doing. Yesterday, what we saw in the case of Mr. Abrego Garcia is the court gave the plaintiffs the opportunity to take up to 6 depositions of government officials of their choice and up to 15 requests for documents. So I imagine what we're going to see next is, let's get Marco Rubio under oath. Let's get Pam Bondi under oath. Let's get Kristi Noem under oath. Let's get people who are close to the ground. There was somebody who submitted a document on Saturday that said Mr. Abrego Garcia is alive and secure. Let's get that guy under oath. How do you know that? Let's get a picture of him, where he is. Is he safe? Is he healthy? Is he uninjured? So I think those are the steps that we're going to see in the absence of perhaps jailing somebody who is defying a court order.
But Barb, when do you think that will happen? When do you think the courts will put higher Trump officials like Marco Rubio under oath?
Well, I think this order that we got from the judge yesterday, ordering the depositions of up to 6 officials of the plaintiff's choice, I think they're going to notice those depositions for this week. I think the appalling thing about this whole situation is that Mr. Abrego Garcia has now been in this prison for more than 30 days. And remember, the reason he was withheld from removal back to El Salvador, even though he lacked legal status in this country, was based on a court finding that if he returned to El Salvador, he would be persecuted because his family's business was extorted by gangs. He fled El Salvador at the age of 16, he says, because he was in danger of being either harmed or recruited to join these gangs. His brother did the same. And so if he is now back in this prison in El Salvador for terrorists that is occupied mostly by gang members, he is likely at risk of being harmed in that very prison. And so every day that goes by, I think, puts him in danger of irreparable harm. And so one hopes that and expects that the plaintiffs will very quickly notice these depositions, get these people under oath, and find out what's really going on here and why is it we are not bringing him back right now.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. We're discussing the Trump administration's violation of court orders and what that might mean for Michiganders. Our guest is Barb McQuade. She's a law professor at the University of Michigan and former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. Barb, I want to discuss the local impact of the Trump administration violating court orders. In March, the Trump administration eliminated a legal aid program serving thousands of unaccompanied children across the U.S. Now, in April, a judge ordered the government to restore the program while the case is litigated. Still, many organizations like the Michigan Immigrants' Rights Center haven't received that money, and they've had to lay people off. What kinds of consequences do you think Trump violating court orders could have on Michiganders?
Well, there's the direct impact of people who are denied funding, layoffs, shuttering of organizations, and the end of services. But we've seen this in other cases where the administration was ordered to preserve the status quo, providing U.S. aid, for example. And they failed to do that, and they had to go back to court again and again to push them to comply with those court orders. In most instances, we've seen them comply with those court orders, but not in every instance. And it really seems to be an effort to say the judiciary cannot check the president when it comes to certain powers. There is a theory under the Constitution that because the Constitution vests the executive power in a president of the United States, that it vests all of the executive power in the president of the United States, and that therefore no one can tell him how to spend federal funds, no one can tell him who to hire, no one can tell him who to fire. That view, in my opinion, is contrary to the concept of our Constitution, which, as every school child learns, is all about a separation of powers to avoid giving any one of the three co-equal branches of government too much power. And that's why the legislature has the power of the purse. And they say, here's the money, here's what it's for. And the executive branch is just supposed to execute the law. You know, they're figuring it out. How do we dole out these grants? How do we pay the checks? Who do we send them to? That's the role of the executive. And then, of course, if the executive should violate its responsibilities, that's when the courts come in. And they say, you violated a statute. The law says you're supposed to send out these payments. You must do so. You're not. Pay up. And so for the Trump administration to say, make me, I'm not going to, and push it all the way to the Supreme Court, in my view, is a violation of that constitutional separation of powers. And that's why we're seeing so many lawsuits across the country trying to check those. By and large, the plaintiffs are winning these cases. They're getting temporary restraining orders, which is just an order at the outset where a plaintiff shows a substantial likelihood of success on the merits and risk of irreparable harm, that a court order will be ordered just to sort of stall things, like let's preserve the status quo while this case gets litigated. And that's a pretty normal course. The idea that the Trump administration is then just doing what it wants to do anyway, I think is a pretty appalling violation of the separation of powers. I think if we were living in different times, we might see Congress pushing back and saying these are impeachable offenses. But I think with the majority Republican Party in Congress, Trump's own party, they are loath to do that.
The Constitution, in my understanding, is set up to have checks and balances across three branches of government, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. But we do live in a very partisan environment. I don't have to tell you that. And what that often means is that branches are not checking each other. Instead, they're often working in tandem with one another if they're part of the same party. Do you think that that's the kind of political world we're living in now?
I think it is at the moment. I hope it doesn't last that long. I think at some point there will be a line that is crossed that I hope even members of the president's own party will say is a bridge too far. It has been said that we no longer live in a nation of separation of powers, but a nation of separation of parties. But that, of course, is not what our founding fathers envisioned. They envisioned this idea that we would have three branches of government so that we could check any one branch that became too powerful. And I think in this, what we're seeing right now is the president really flexing and really pushing the limits of presidential power. He's going to test the waters. And at some point, we need that. I mean, the courts, I think, are holding pretty well, but it's disobedience to court orders. I think at the end of the day, the only real check there is impeachment. And that's where Congress comes in. And so let's hope that they are up for the task.
I want to think about the courts for a minute and the ways that Americans view them. I mean, right now, a lot of liberals upset with Trump's policies are hoping the courts block what the president does because Democrats are in the minority in Congress. And that puts the courts outside of the Supreme Court in a position to be viewed as political. I know that the courts don't want to be viewed that way. They want to be seen as neutral arbiters of the law. But right now, a majority of Americans believe that the Supreme Court justices put ideology over impartiality. Do you think Trump's actions have solidified the way people view legal courts?
I have. I think for the past 10 years, Donald Trump has been attacking and trying to undermine courts. One of the goals of Trump, as well as hostile foreign adversaries, is to undermine public confidence in our institutions. That's the courts, that's universities, that's science, that's medicine, that's the press. And we have seen just a full-on assault. Anytime a judge rules against Donald Trump, we see social media posts that they're somehow a radical leftist something or other acting in political ways. Judges certainly come from political backgrounds, and that may color their worldview to some extent. They may have, in larger terms, views about individual rights or views about public safety that reflects the party of the president who put them there. But judges work hard to decide cases based on the facts and the law as they see it. And so, for example, we had a judge who is, I think he was an Obama appointee, Judge James Boasberg in the District of Columbia. This guy is as an institutionalist as they come. He has served on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, where he was placed by Chief Justice John Roberts. He was a college roommate of Brett Kavanaugh. There's nothing about this guy that makes him a radical leftist. Yet when he ruled that deportations must be stopped because they violate due process, President Trump started calling him a radical leftist. Attorney General Pam Bondi accused him of siding with the terrorists over the safety of the American people. This effort to undermine public confidence in judges is going to cause us to lose faith. And, for our nation's history, that is the way we have resolved our disputes in this country. We may have very wildly divergent opinions, but we agree that we resolve our differences in courts of law, and then we obey those decisions. To stop obeying courts means that we have turned into a society that is all about power versus law. It becomes anarchy, and it encourages vigilante violence where people take the law into their own hands. I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a world like that. I don't like my odds as a small, older, frail female without a lot of money and a lot of political power. I don't think I would fare too well in that world. And I don't think most of us want to live in a world that's lawless.
Before I let you go, Barb, I do want to think about things from a Republican perspective, because a lot of Republicans might say that former presidents Barack Obama and Joe Biden did some of the same things that Trump is doing now, in that they politicized the courts. Biden appointed more lower court judges than Trump did during his first term. What would you say to folks who think Biden and Obama politicized the courts as well?
Absolute nonsense. The idea that they would speak out or defy a court order the way Donald Trump has. I mean, certainly presidents are allowed to choose the lawyers they think will best represent the interests of the people, and they also tend to reflect the worldview of the president who appointed them. And so my problem is not with Donald Trump's appointees. It is the way he undermines judges who rule against him. We've seen calls for impeachment of judges simply because they ruled against the administration. My guess is if you look at the comments of Presidents Obama and Biden after an adverse ruling, they would not have said this was some hack judge. They would say, perhaps reasonable minds can disagree. We will appeal this decision, but we respect the role of the court. That's the difference that we are seeing today. What appears to me to be a deliberate effort to undermine public confidence in our judiciary.
Barb McQuade is a University of Michigan law professor and former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. Barb, it's always a pleasure to have you on the Metro.
Thank you, Robin.
From the WDET newsroom, the ACLU of Michigan is asking a federal judge in Detroit to stop the termination of 4 international college students' visas. The students were attending the University of Michigan and Wayne State University, respectively, until their documentation was removed by the federal government with no explanation. The ACLU of Michigan says the case fits into a larger narrative of the Trump administration's attitude toward immigrants. It says over 1,000 students have had their visas terminated, and their goal is to have the students' documents reinstated. Coming up, spring is in the air and bird watchers are out. We'll speak with a local expert on birds to better understand the different types that are flying around Metro Detroit. And we want to hear from you. Do you have a favorite bird call? And which bird do you think should represent the city of Detroit? Give us a call. The number is 313-577-1019. This is the Metro. Stay with us.